Well, good morning, Energy Rogue Nation. Welcome back to another weather discussion. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Before I do get started with today's video, I just want to remind everybody that tomorrow I will be live with Brian and Bill on the Energy Rogue YouTube channel, where we will be talking about the rest of the season when it comes to the tropics. Are we going to see the tropics wake up in the second half of this hurricane season, or is it going to be quiet like it is? We'll also be talking about the temperature trends for both the fall and the winter season as we head into the second half of 2024 and into early 2025. A lot of talk about La Nina. What implications would that have on our winter season? You're going to want to stay tuned to find out more about that tomorrow. And something that I haven't talked about here on these videos that I will be discussing tomorrow is also the European weather for this upcoming winter season. What does that look like for them as we track not just La Nina, but really more so the North Atlantic Oscillation, which has a stronger teleconnection and correlation to European weather. So we'll be discussing all of that on tomorrow's live stream. You can check it out on the Energy Rogue YouTube channel. It's going to be live at 12 p.m. Central, noon Central, 1 p.m. Eastern. You're going to want to definitely tune in for that. And feel free to ask questions. I always tell you guys, I'm sure it annoys the hell out of you, but ask questions, especially true for the live stream, because I will be answering any and all questions on the live stream itself. So come prepared, bring a cup of coffee or whatever you drink in the afternoon, and also bring your questions because I'll be happy to answer those. Okay, so with this discussion though, with what we're talking about today, we're not going to start with the tropics. Instead, we're going to start first by diving a little bit deeper into some temperature trends, both in the short and long term. Now, I want to remind folks that aren't really aware of this that we now have a weather website, particularly for energy and ag markets. That is wxrogue.com, right here in the top search bar. That's wxrogue.com. And this is a website, at least this page, I should say, that is completely free. And no cost to you to use this or to access these charts that are currently plotted. And especially these maps, these are just from NOAA, so I mean that's certainly free, of course. But these charts where we're talking about population weight degree days, cooling degree days for Midwest cities, and as well as total degree days comparison from 2 days ago to now, that's all available completely free to you. All you have to do is go to wxrogue.com and you can check out all of these maps. These are updated by the run, and they're also updated daily. So these are constantly updated to provide you the latest information. Again, you're going to want to check these out. And also, we are working on essentially a product down the line that would have a lot more content to it. This is just scratching the surface, guys. And one thing I want you to note, as I've talked about, we are only referring to the GFS model. And that is certainly not to say that we can't create a model suite of both short and long range. I'm talking about climate models, the NAM, the HRRR for the short term, the next few days, the GFS and the European. So this is really scratching the surface. We are not done here. This is certainly not what will essentially be the final product, but this is just giving you a glimpse at what is to come. And this portion that you're looking at right here is completely free. I highly recommend you check it out. And the theme of the day has been questions. If you have any questions on even this page and you want some clarification on these numbers and how they are derived, I'm happy to share that with you just to provide you additional transparency and context with how these numbers are calculated. That being said, as we take a look here at our population weighted degree days by EIA region, we have been talking about the trend for the southern United States. Over these next couple of weeks, it's going to be rather warm and in some cases well above normals for places like Texas and New Mexico. And that certainly is depicted here on our population weighted chart. This is, of course, taking from the GFS, like I said, but it's also using a population weight to show you not just the amount or the quantity of cooling degree days, but also how the population weight of each region influences those values. So, for example, the West South Central is trending higher in terms of its CDD, especially as we get towards the rest of the week. And this makes sense with a lot of what we're talking about. There's very high confidence with our entire model suite from the GFS ensemble to the European ensemble, that we are expected to see a relatively amplified ridge out in the south central United States in the Four Corners that's going to thereby increase our temperatures. And because we have a pretty sizable population in a place like Texas, which encompasses much of the population for the west south central EIA region, we would then expect these values to be the highest out of the three regions, especially as we talk about the Pacific region that is expected to decrease its temperatures over the next several days as it gets on the other end of that upper level ridge and more of that Pacific milder air. And then, of course, for the Midwest and the Middle Atlantic, because our high pressure out west, that much of the jet flow is riding over top of that, well, that is bringing some cooler conditions equatorward to places like the central United States and the Mid-Atlantic. So, of course, we would expect for these values to be pretty low in between the four regions. So the main event, as the GFS is depicting on this chart, is going to be for the south central United States. And if we know anything about the news cycles, they tend to gravitate more towards the heat as opposed towards cooler temperatures. So more of the temperature extremes. If we were talking about really cold, unseasonable temperatures like a hard freeze, for example, that would certainly make waves and headlines, and that would also be something we'd be talking about here. But in this case, we're talking just more about below normals, feeling more like fall for the central United States over the next 6 to 10 days, even going out the next 14 days. And if you take a closer look at the Midwest, of course, all of these cities from Chicago to Cleveland are expected to see their temperatures continue to decline here over the next several days, definitely towards the cooler side. But like I said, just to note here, these cooler temperatures are exactly that. They are cooler. We're not talking about our first freeze or any extreme of that nature. This is simply just more fall-like feel to the weather. If you're from the Midwest like me, right now it does feel a little bit like fall without the leaves turning colors, so you're definitely getting a glimpse of it if you're in the lower Great Lakes like myself, or even in the corn belts of Iowa and Missouri. So other than that, I mean, really for the next couple of weeks, the main event is going to be the south central United States for a lot of those warmer and hot temperatures, and potentially for the rest of the month. Now, what we'll talk about here in a moment is I don't expect this to last very long. And I'm going to use my words carefully. You'll see what I mean in a second. But what I mean is I don't expect well above normal temperatures to be in the southern United States past September. However, what you're going to find here in just a moment is that if we look at some of our climate models, it's not necessarily saying it's going to be hot in the southern United States, but the general pattern would actually favor more of milder conditions. Pacific flow, more zonal flow, cutting across the United States. More on that in a moment. But the other chart I wanted to show you that's not currently available on this page, I showed it last time around, but let me show it to you again. This would be, let me just go ahead and play it here, if it will. Oh, I guess not. Let me see here. Let's do that one. I don't know what happened here, guys. Originally, I had this video up. I don't know if it's this one. Yes, it is. Okay. So this here is essentially our plotted. This is not, by the way, just like the products I showed you on the Energy Rogue page or the WX Rogue page, those are products that we are providing. This is also a product that we have derived ourselves. This is not something we're pulling from Tropical Tidbits. As a matter of fact, I don't know of any website that will actually plot CDDs and HDDs on a map of this sort. I know there may be some companies out there that will actually provide graphics where they hand draw out sort of these isotherms and show, for example, you know, this part of the country is 20 CDD and this is 30, but I don't know if there's anybody doing something like this. So this is very unique. I like this a lot because what it's doing is, just like what we showed on those charts, this product in particular is showing us cooling degree days and heating degree days from the GFS, just like what we were looking at, except it's being plotted with a general color table. Now, as I mentioned before when I showed you this a couple days back, this product, this is not finalized. For example, one thing that I want to do is I want to change this color table so that way it's not bloody red across the United States when there's no heating degree days. I would rather have it to where the state boundaries, for example, show up a lot clearer. This red isn't as potent, and this is an easy fix. We can just change out the color tables, but I want this to look a little bit more visually appealing, and also to a degree with cooling degree days. Although I do like the look of this one better because it's just, like I said, the color table is flipped inversely. And so our blues actually stand out a little bit better, which allows for the states to not be masked by the dark colors. So anyway, you can tell there's a lot of things that need to be improved here, but the general product itself of just simply plotting HDD and CDD values is doing quite well, I have to say. So if we take a look here over the next few days, we see that the highest values of cooling degree days, according to the GFS and also the European, is going to be centered within this area, especially the Red River valleys of Oklahoma and Texas, where we can expect to see CDD values pretty much in some cases north of, say, 20 cooling degree days in some cases. So it's going to be rather elevated for that part of the country. Interestingly enough, Texas's power grid is a very interesting one, as we've seen. So, of course, there's kind of a weird irony with that the hottest temperatures are likely to be in Texas and their relatively vulnerable power grid. But nonetheless, this heat, of course, will stick around over the next couple of weeks. The rest of the country looks to be rather cool. Now, you may see these dark blues, for example, and think, oh, well, if we have 0 CDD, well, then we must have heating degree days. Not necessarily. As a matter of fact, our temperature is staying within, say, high 60s, low 70s in a lot of these areas. And as a result, that by definition, if we're using a base temperature of 65, is not considered heating degree days because it's not below that base threshold. So in this case, while we don't have a lot of CDDs showing up for the Midwest and Northeast, we're also not seeing conditions conducive for heating degree days either. Now you can see though, towards the heating degree days map, you see this coloring of about 5 to 10 HDD. And that would take us towards really the latter half of next week. And here's the thing. I think the GFS has shown to be too bullish on the cold. There is a cold tendency with the GFS. So we have to take that into consideration. I'm certainly not expecting anywhere near 10 HDDs. We could see anywhere between 0 to 5 by that period. But again, it's still too far out to make those kind of assumptions. The general trend is, if anything, we'll likely just see a continuation of some fall-like weather for the Midwest and the Northeast. But for the most part, again, the main storyline over this period, the next couple weeks, is really going to be, as we've talked about, the southern half of the United States. And that is in part due to the upper level ridge, that high pressure that is likely to amplify and expand northward and take much of your jet flow and crash it across the mid-Atlantic, the Midwest, and the upper Midwest, keeping conditions rather rainy, variable, and mostly cooler on some of these days. So that is the current trend. This map is, I should say, this chart is not available at the moment on the webpage, but I am showing it to you just to give you some context and a visual of what we were seeing on our end. But again, WX Rogue, check it out, and you will not be disappointed. That being said, give me some feedback. Let me know anything, any thoughts on those products, and any ways that we can improve it. Okay, so now we turn our attention to the long range. We talked about the next few weeks, hotter temperatures above average for the southern United States, cooler temperatures for the Midwest, the Northeast, and the upper Midwest. But if we look long term, there's some interesting things that show up that I think need to be addressed. So this is the CFS, and we are looking at the 500 millibar geopotential height. This is our jet stream. Anytime you've heard me talk about 500 millibars, just remember that is just the translation for the jet stream that we are focused on. So in this case, these models tend to go out several months, all the way out to May of 2025. But we're mostly concerned about September, October, November, and even getting into early 2025. So at the moment, we have this upper level ridge that we've talked about here the last month and a half, where we've seen hotter than normal temperatures for the western United States and even the south central United States. And much of your jet flow has been displaced and has crashed through the Midwest, the Northeast, and the Mid-Atlantic. Now, there's been some fluctuation here. We haven't been cooler than normal for the Midwest necessarily. We have seen, some fluctuations with our temperatures. There's been some days where we saw heat indexes, for example, in the Midwest, anywhere between 100 to 105. And then we saw temperatures, around the 80s thereafter. So we've seen a lot of fluctuation in those particular cases. But the general idea over these last 2 months has been this high pressure effect. Now, what the CFS and even the CANCIPS is picking up on is a transition more so to a zonal pattern. So rather than our jet flow moving over top of our ridge and crashing down into the mid-Atlantic and the Northeast, instead, it's showing more of this zonal flow. Now, what does that mean? If we have zonal flow across the United States, that typically implies not cold and not hot, mostly mild. Now, there's going to be some cases where, say, places like the southern United States will still likely be somewhat above normals, but it just may not be as hot as what we're seeing now, right? It's going to be more just above normals for that period. So we could see temperatures still, let's say in the high 80s and low 90s, but to see consistent 100s and 105s in places like Texas as actual air temperature is not necessarily a likely scenario. But what zonal does imply for most of the country is milder conditions. Because, think about it, a lot of our westerly flow is now coming from the Pacific, right? We don't have any flow that's coming from the poles and crashing down into the Midwest and the Northeast. Instead, rather than that, your jet flow is just zonal. It's cutting right across from the Pacific out towards the eastern seaboard. There's no air that's moving poleward here. Instead, it's coming from the Pacific. Those westerlies are carrying milder Pacific air, and that means, subsequently, milder temperatures. So, if we show this and go out just through October and November, we see similar occurrences here. As a matter of fact, we even have some ridging taking place yet again for the Rockies, which would also lead to a continuation of milder and even in some cases above normal temperatures. And we really don't see troughing or poleward movement of air until we get to November and December. Now, I have a hunch as to why this is, and it's likely because of the fact that right now we are transitioning from an ENSO-neutral pattern to a La Nina. La Nina patterns tend to favor more troughing that digs across the Midwest and especially in some cases the Northeast and New England regions, bringing mostly colder than normal temperatures, right? So if you hear people talking about La Nina, that's the reason why, because for a lot of these northern states, it tends to favor colder temperatures than normal, and even in some cases, above average snowfall, which above average snowfall, especially as we create a snowpack, can also lead to colder air temperatures due to albedo. I won't get into albedo effect, but if you have a snowpack and it stays consistent on the ground and it's a good depth, that can actually lead to colder air temperatures as well locally. So that also has implications. So this model, as well as the CANCIPS, has been very consistent about this. And if we look at the temperature anomalies this far out, we can actually pull these up, 2-meter temperatures. And as you can see, we head into September. Look at how we don't have really above normal temperatures, but they're slightly above normal, which would imply more of a milder temperature regime. But we also notice that there's very little cold because of it, except if you're talking about off the coast, or even for areas like the northern plains and the upper Midwest that have a much lower population density. Much of our major population centers in this case are going to be looking at some above normals for the month of September, more than likely. And I would put that at about a 60% chance probability here. If we look towards October, October's a little bit more bullish, but we are still seeing above normal temperatures, right? We're seeing, once again, a milder regime. And for those of you that are watching, you're probably like, man, Brendan, it feels like a broken record, right? Last year, in even the first half of winter and much of fall, we were talking about pretty much the same thing, if not warmer conditions for the southern United States. I remember Texas was scorching last year. We think this year was bad. Last year, places like Texas and Louisiana, Mississippi really had the heat cranked from El Nino. And this time around, even still, it may not be necessarily as hot in comparison to last year, but for the fall, very similar trends with what we've seen over these last couple of years of just more of these milder conditions for much of the United States. We take this, of course, into November, and we begin to see some cooler pockets show up in the Pacific Northwest, an association of some additional troughing. Remember, this air is now moving poleward under this regime, so we begin to see a decrease in some of these temperature anomalies, especially out towards the Midwest and much of the Northeast. But nonetheless, as that moves through, of course, December is also showing above normal temperatures, and January above normal if we go further out. This takes us into February. That's when we start to see more of the colder temperature regime. So take this model at face value, okay? Especially as we go out to January and February, because it is still too early to call, in my opinion. We are not in La Nina quite yet, although we are getting pretty close at this point. But what I want you to really take away from this is not the winter, more so the fall. Because the fall is pointing towards milder conditions once again, and that makes sense because we are expecting to see more of a zonal jet pattern that would thereby bring in milder conditions. Again, not saying record warmth. I'm not expecting that for September, October, November, but I am expecting some milder conditions before we then see sort of a transition to winter right around December, January, February. Now, one other thing I want to point out. I know I'm really stringing this along, and I'm trying to foreshadow this for Wednesday. But if we assess my prediction from last year, for those of you that have been Energy Rogue members for a while, you know that I predicted a second half flip of winter under the El Nino regime last year. I am not predicting that this time around. I don't think we're going to see a quote-unquote flip. I think we're going to have more of a consistent winter as opposed to what we had last year, which was, in turn, very mild. That being said, my question is not about the winter season. My question is, how cold is it truly going to get? Because ultimately what dictates how cold it's going to get is how cold our polar air is, how solid our snowpack is in the Canadian provinces. All those factors is what helps to influence how cold is cold, right? How much cold air are we going to bring down? How amplified will that be once it is advected south into the Midwest and the northern United States by the time we get to December and January? I don't quite know. And to be honest with you, the last couple La Ninas have kind of fallen flat too. So that is going to be a very interesting thing to sniff out. And I really don't think that we'll have clarity on that, likely until probably around October, I would say, where we can give a little bit of a better prediction. But for now, we do know that it is likely, based on my prediction and based on my analysis, to be a more consistent winter. But what I'm also trying to figure out and awaiting is really how cold is it going to get? And that ultimately is the question at the end of the day for many of you. So you're going to want to watch that space, and I'm hoping to have a better prediction for you guys by the time we get to October on that front. Now, we're going to end things off here with the latest on Ernesto. And as I talked about yesterday, we are not anticipating this storm making landfall. It is highly likely that we are going to see this steered out away from the Atlantic coastline. Of course, taking a look at Ernesto this morning, you can see really nice consolidated convection, a very clear center. This is something that we really haven't seen here over the last 48 hours or so, and now we are beginning to see it. So that certainly the model guidance has been picking up on this, and it's done a very good job at essentially identifying that this would be a feature right around this time today. And we are likely to see what will be Hurricane Ernesto probably by the time it passes Puerto Rico later on tonight into tomorrow morning, where we will see it reach hurricane status. It could even make landfall as a low-end hurricane in Puerto Rico. We'll see, but it's going to be a pretty close call. And by the way, not just do we have convection consolidation near the center, which is healthy, but these outer bands are also beginning to fire up too. Look at all that on the northeast quadrant of Tropical Storm Ernesto. Really healthy development. The Atlantic certainly is alive and well. But are we going to see a landfall on the coastlines, as we just mentioned? Likely not. I would put it at less at this point than a 2% chance, considering our current weather pattern. But I did want to show you this. We talked about the aircraft reconnaissance missions yesterday, and boy, what a difference does a day make. Think about what we saw yesterday. Recall what I posted. This was essentially, this is August 13th. This isn't the right sounding. But there was one I had posted yesterday on the Discord that showed something very similar to this. A lot of dry air intrusion throughout much of the profile of this system. Now, we are seeing a lot more saturation within all levels of Tropical Storm Ernesto. And this is a great sign. We clearly see that on infrared satellite, a lot of development. But even if you didn't have the IR satellite at your disposal, we can see based on our drop zone data that we have a lot more saturation taking place, which is telling us that this storm is not eating much dry air as it did a day or so ago, and is not dealing with much wind shear as it did yesterday. So this storm has been definitely intensifying over the last 12 to 24 hours. And I will conclude with this. This is, of course, the strength index and the spread of the data based on all the model guidance of what we expect the strength of Ernesto to be over these next several days. And we have a pretty wide model spread, but really anywhere between a Cat 1 to a Cat 3. And I know you can't see that because that's written in black. Let me write that here in pink, but this is a Cat 1 to Cat 3 probability. And honestly, my prediction right now is I'm seeing this more of a Cat 1 to a Cat 2. It could reach major status if we undergo rapid intensification, but I am not anticipating that. I think based on the current parameter space, it will intensify. I think Cat 3 is kind of pushing it, but we shall see. And then finally, the track. Let me show you that too before we call it a day. And as you can see, right, our GFS ensemble, pretty high confidence here, guys. Remember, our upper level ridge out west, a lot of jet flow is cutting across the mid-Atlantic like we talked about. That is keeping this system pretty much far away from the coast. And of course, there are some solutions that do show a landfall near New Brunswick, Nova Scotia. That remains to be seen, but at least for a United States landfall, that is very much out of the cards at this point. One last thing. I know I said one last thing before, but I just remembered one more thing I wanted to go over. Let's head on back to the climate models that I showed you to start. And what I want to do is focus your attention on the CFS monthly on this jet stream map that we looked at. So the tropics right now has been rather quiet, right? I mean, I know a lot of folks in the meteorology community, even myself, were predicting a above average hurricane season, and that can still happen. We're not even halfway through the season yet, but at least right now it's rather quiet. Now, you have to remember, we are seeing the Atlantic Basin wake up just as I predicted, right? Just as what we were seeing here with sort of the conditions coming together, Sahara dust decreasing, shear decreasing, creating more of an environment for development near the Atlantic Basin. However, as I've just mentioned with Ernesto, that system is being steered out to sea because of our current jet pattern. Well, what happens if we turn zonal? Well, here's what that would mean. That would essentially mean that, yes, we could hypothetically still have storms fire off here in the Atlantic and be steered out to sea. However, any storm that was to fire in the Caribbean and the Gulf would easily be able to make its way up towards Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida. Because our jet pattern is now zonal, there's really not much steering that storm. And if we know anything about our sea surface temperatures right now, you can probably guess who has the warmest sea surface temperatures. Believe it or not, it's the Gulf. We're talking about well over 30 degrees Celsius. That is the hot spot right now. Very warm sea surface temperatures, once again record-breaking. So one thing that I want you guys to be aware of is not just the Atlantic Basin, but keep an eye on the Gulf as we head into September. We may not see much activity here, at least in the short term, due to our current pattern, but if we trend more zonal into September, like the climate models are saying, then we have to keep a very close eye on the Gulf and the Caribbean, because at any time we could see a system form under that environment, and there's really not much steering it under that jet pattern. And instead, hypothetically, that could mean implications for, once again, Texas, Louisiana. So we are not out of the woods in the Gulf whatsoever. As a matter of fact, those sea surface temperatures are scorching right now. All we need is the environment, aside from the sea surface temperatures, to support conducive tropical development. Anyway, thank you all so much for tuning in. I greatly appreciate all of your feedback and support. Like I mentioned, I will be live tomorrow with Brian and Bill talking more about all the topics we talked about today and more. That you can tune in, Energy Rogue YouTube channel and LinkedIn, live at 12 p.m. Central, 1 p.m. Eastern. I look forward to seeing all of you there. And with that, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you back here tomorrow afternoon. Take care.